My name is Charlotte Carlisle, and I'm 72 years old. 3 weeks before Christmas, I walked into my own guest bedroom and discovered a betrayal so shocking it nearly stopped my heart. What I found there was my husband of 45 years, Gerald, tangled in my Egyptian cotton sheets with my younger sister Andrea. But let me tell you something about underestimating a grandmother who spent 5 decades building an empire while everyone else was taking credit.
Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from, and if this story touches you, make sure you're a subscriber, because tomorrow, I've saved something extra special for you. Tell us a duh.
We don't just cry into our tea when life breaks us, we rebuild, and when we do, we make sure those who betrayed us understand exactly what they've lost. The image is burned into my memory like a brand on cattle. It was 2:30 on a Tuesday afternoon in December, the kind of crisp winter day that makes the windows in our Georgian mansion sparkle like diamonds. I'd returned early from my weekly charity board meeting at the Seeley Foundation, the very foundation I'd helped establish 30 years ago with my late father's initial investment and my own relentless fundraising efforts. The meeting had been cut short due to a sudden snowstorm warning, and I'd driven my silver Mercedes through the increasingly treacherous roads, eager to get home to prepare Gerald's favorite pot roast for dinner. Our estate in Millfield had always been my sanctuary. 15 acres of perfectly manicured grounds, a main house with 12 bedrooms, and outbuildings that included a guest cottage where Andrea had been staying for the past 6 months. My sister, 5 years younger than me, had moved in after her messy divorce from that worthless husband of hers, claiming she needed time to find herself and get back on her feet financially. Like the fool I'd always been when it came to family, I'd opened my doors without question, giving her the entire west wing of the house, and even setting up a monthly allowance so she could maintain her dignity while she figured out her next steps. I'd parked in the circular driveway, noting that Gerald's Bentley was still in the garage, unusual for a Tuesday, since he typically spent his afternoons at the country club playing golf with his retirement cronies. At 73, my husband had settled into a routine of leisure that I'd funded through decades of carefully managed investments and business decisions. While he'd enjoyed the fruits of what he called our success, I'd been the one actually building and maintaining the financial foundation that kept us living like royalty. The house felt different when I walked in. Too quiet but not empty quiet. The kind of quiet that happens when people are trying very hard not to be heard. I'd set my leather handbag and coat on the marble table in the foyer, calling out Gerald's name as I always did when I returned home. No answer. The grandfather clock in the hallway ticked with its usual precision, marking each second of what would become the last normal moments of my marriage. I'd walked through our main living areas, checking Gerald's study, the library, even the conservatory, where he sometimes napped in his favorite leather chair. Nothing. It wasn't until I heard what sounded like muffled laughter coming from upstairs that I began to feel the first prickle of unease. The sound was coming from the direction of the guest wing, Andrea's temporary domain. My footsteps on the Persian carpet runners made no sound as I climbed the wide staircase, my hand trailing along the mahogany banister that had been polished to perfection by our housekeeper just that morning. The laughter grew clearer as I approached the guest bedroom at the end of the hall, accompanied by sounds that made my stomach clench with a terrible growing certainty. The door was slightly ajar, just enough for me to see inside without being noticed. Just enough for my world to shatter into a million irreparable pieces. There they were. Gerald, my husband of 45 years, the father of my 3 children, the man I'd stood by through his failed business ventures, his drinking problem in his 40s, his minor heart attack 5 years ago. And Andrea, my baby sister, the woman I'd helped raise after our parents died in that car accident when she was just 16. The sister I'd put through college, The sister I'd supported through 3 failed marriages. The sister I'd welcomed into my home, without question when she claimed to have nowhere else to go. They were in my guest bed, among the Italian silk sheets I'd personally selected, acting like lovesick teenagers without a care in the world. Gerald's thinning gray hair was disheveled, his reading glasses folded neatly on the nightstand as if he'd planned this encounter carefully. Andrea's auburn hair, maintained at the expensive salon I paid for, was spread across my pillowcases like she owned the place. But it wasn't just the physical betrayal that nearly brought me to my knees in that hallway. It was the casual intimacy between them. The way Gerald traced patterns on Andrea's bare shoulder with a tenderness he hadn't shown me in years. The way she laughed at something he whispered, throwing her head back with the kind of uninhibited joy I couldn't remember seeing in our house since our children were small. This wasn't a moment of weakness or a single mistake, this was a relationship. An affair that had clearly been going on for weeks, maybe months, right under my nose, in my own home, while I continued to provide for both of them like the devoted wife and generous sister I'd always been. I stood there for what felt like hours but was probably only minutes, watching the 2 people I'd loved and trusted most in the world make a mockery of every sacrifice I'd made for them. The irony wasn't lost on me that I was witnessing this betrayal in a room I'd decorated myself, in a house I'd largely paid for, on sheets I'd chosen because Andrea had mentioned they were beautiful when we'd seen them in that boutique in Charleston last month. As I quietly backed away from the door, my mind began working with the cold precision that had made me successful in business for decades. This wasn't just about a cheating husband or an ungrateful sister, this was about 2 people who had systematically taken advantage of my generosity while plotting behind my back to destroy everything I'd built. They had no idea that the woman they'd just betrayed controlled every aspect of the life they were so casually enjoying. But they were about to learn exactly what happened when you bit the hand that had been feeding you for decades. The game had changed, and Charlotte Carlisle always played to win. The foundation of my generosity toward Gerald and Andrea hadn't been built in a day. It had been constructed over decades of deliberate choices, each one seemingly small at the time, but collectively representing a lifetime of putting their needs before my own financial security and personal happiness. My relationship with Gerald began in 1978 when I was 27 and he was 28. I'd already established myself as a successful real estate investor, having inherited a modest sum from my grandmother and parlayed it into a portfolio of rental properties throughout the county. Gerald was charming, handsome, and completely broke. He'd graduated from college with a degree in English literature and romantic dreams of becoming a novelist, but no practical plan for supporting himself while pursuing his artistic ambitions. I fell in love with his passion and creativity, qualities that seemed to complement my business acumen perfectly. What I didn't realize was that I was also falling in love with the idea of being needed, of being the practical foundation that would allow someone else's dreams to flourish. When we married in 1979, I was already financially supporting both of us, while Gerald worked on his great American novel in the converted barn behind my first house. The novel never materialized into anything publishable, but Gerald's expectations of being supported certainly did. By 1985, when our first child was born, I was managing a real estate portfolio worth over $2 million while Gerald had transitioned from failed novelist to failed entrepreneur. He'd convinced me to invest in a series of business ventures, a small restaurant that folded within 6 months, a boutique clothing store that never turned a profit, and a consulting firm that existed primarily on paper and my financial backing. Each failure was met with renewed promises that the next venture would be different, that he just needed one more chance to prove himself. And each time, I found myself writing another check, liquidating another property, or borrowing against our assets to fund his latest dream.
Preparing and narrating this story took us a lot of time, so if you are enjoying it, subscribe to our channel. It means a lot to us. Now back to the story.
By the time our 3 children, William, Colleen, and Nikita, were in elementary school, I'd essentially become the sole financial provider for our family, while maintaining the fiction that Gerald was a serial entrepreneur, rather than a man living off his wife's success. The pattern with Andrea was remarkably similar, though it began much later, and with even less justification. After our parents died in 1995, I became her legal guardian despite being only 5 years older. At 35, I was juggling an expanding real estate empire, 3 young children, and a husband whose business ventures continued to drain our resources. Adding a grieving 16-year-old to the mix should have been impossible, but I made it work because that's what I always did. I made things work. I paid for Andrea's private school tuition, her college education at an expensive liberal arts college, and her living expenses throughout her 20s as she found herself through a series of part-time jobs and artistic pursuits. When she married her first husband at 28, I helped fund their wedding and gave them a down payment for their house. When that marriage ended 3 years later, I paid for her divorce attorney and covered her living expenses until she was back on her feet. The second marriage followed the same pattern. I helped with wedding costs, provided financial support during rocky periods, and ultimately paid for another expensive divorce when that relationship inevitably collapsed. By the time Andrea was contemplating her third marriage in 2010, I'd invested well over $400,000 in her various life transitions, not counting the informal loans that were never repaid, and the gifts that coincided suspiciously with her financial emergencies. But it wasn't just the money, though the financial cost was staggering when I finally calculated it years later. It was the emotional labor, the constant availability I maintained for both Gerald and Andrea's needs, while my own desires and interests took a permanent backseat to their crises and ambitions. I'd missed countless social events because Gerald needed me to network with potential investors for his latest scheme. I'd postponed vacations I wanted to take, because Andrea was going through another difficult period and needed my support. I'd turned down lucrative business opportunities that would have required travel because my family needed me to be available for their various emergencies and demands. The real estate empire I'd built became the family ATM, funding not just Gerald's failed businesses and Andrea's lifestyle transitions, but also supporting our 3 children through expensive private schools, elite colleges, and the early years of their own careers. I told myself I was building generational wealth, creating opportunities for the people I loved most. What I was actually doing was enabling a family-wide assumption that Charlotte Carlisle's resources were community property, while Charlotte Carlisle's needs were irrelevant. The most painful part wasn't even the money, it was the gradual erosion of my own identity. Somewhere in the process of funding everyone else's dreams and solving everyone else's problems, I'd stopped having dreams of my own. My friends knew me as Gerald's wife and Andrea's sister, not as Charlotte the successful businesswoman. My children saw me as the reliable problem solver, not as an individual with interests and desires beyond their immediate needs. By 2020, when Andrea moved in after her third divorce, I owned properties worth over $12 million, had an investment portfolio that generated substantial passive income, and maintained our luxurious lifestyle entirely through my own financial management. Gerald had long since stopped even pretending to contribute financially, settling into a comfortable retirement funded by my decades of work. Andrea had never held a job for more than 2 years and had never contributed a meaningful amount to her own support. Yet somehow, in the family narrative, Gerald was the charming patriarch who'd done well for himself. Andrea was the free spirit who just needed time to find her path. I was simply the background figure who made everything possible, reliable, capable Charlotte, who could be counted on to write the checks and solve the problems while staying quietly in the supporting role. The guest wing where I'd found them together had cost me $150,000 to renovate specifically for Andrea's comfort. The Egyptian cotton sheets they'd desecrated were $800 said I'd purchased because she'd admired them during one of our shopping trips. Even Gerald's afternoon availability for infidelity was made possible by the retirement I funded, in the house I maintained, surrounded by the luxury my business success had provided. As I stood in my kitchen that December afternoon, mechanically preparing the pot roast Gerald would never eat, I began calculating not just the financial cost of my generosity, but the price I'd paid in self-respect, personal fulfillment, and authentic relationships. The numbers were staggering, but the emotional toll was incalculable. For 45 years, I'd been the engine that powered everyone else's life, while my own remained largely unlived. That was about to change. Looking back with the brutal clarity that only comes after betrayal, I could see how Gerald and Andrea had systematically trained me to accept less while giving more, creating a dynamic where my value was measured entirely by my usefulness to them. Gerald's manipulation had been so gradual, so expertly executed, that I'd mistaken it for the natural evolution of a long marriage. In the early years, he'd shower me with affection and gratitude after each failed business venture, making me feel like a hero for believing in him, when banks wouldn't. He'd tell our friends how lucky he was to have such a brilliant and supportive wife, always in contexts where my financial support was framed as emotional generosity rather than economic necessity. But as the years passed, and his failures mounted, the gratitude transformed into expectation. By the 1990s, Gerald no longer asked if he could pursue a new business opportunity. He simply announced his plans and assumed I'd provide the funding. When I occasionally expressed concern about the mounting costs of his ventures, he'd respond with wounded confusion, asking if I'd stopped believing in their partnership, or suggesting that I was becoming materialistic in my old age. The most insidious part was how he'd reframed my financial success as somehow belonging to both of us, while keeping his failures entirely separate. Our real estate portfolio became our investments in every social conversation, but when his restaurant failed, it was Gerald's bad luck with the location. When I closed a particularly lucrative deal, we'd celebrate our success, but when his consulting business collapsed, I was expected to console him through his disappointment while quietly covering the losses. By the time of his supposed retirement in 2015, Gerald had mastered the art of making his dependence on me appear like natural marital harmony. He'd bragged to his golf buddies about how I was still sharp as a tack in business, while he got to enjoy the fruits of their labor together. The men would chuckle knowingly about how lucky Gerald was to have a wife who handled all that boring financial stuff so he could focus on the important things in life, namely leisure activities that I funded. Andrea's pattern was different, but equally calculated. Where Gerald used charm and wounded masculinity to maintain his access to my resources, Andrea weaponized our family history and her carefully cultivated image as the artistic sister who'd never been good with money. She'd perfected the art of the crisis call, always timed for maximum emotional impact. The first divorce announcement came the day before my birthday, ensuring that my celebration was overshadowed by her need for legal fees. The second marriage's collapse was revealed during William's college graduation weekend, turning what should have been a family celebration into an emergency financial planning session for Andrea's future. But it was the subtle ongoing exploitation that really demonstrated her skill at manipulation. Andrea never asked for money directly. Instead, she'd mention being stressed about bills during family dinners, or casually comment on how expensive everything has gotten while admiring something in a store. She'd developed an entire vocabulary of financial distress that never included direct requests, but always resulted in my offering to help. When she'd moved in 6 months ago, ostensibly temporarily, Andrea had slowly expanded her presence throughout the house, like water seeping through cracks. First it was just the guest wing, then she needed space in the main kitchen for her special dietary requirements. Soon she was hosting friends for dinner parties in my dining room, using my crystal and silver, while presenting herself as the gracious hostess of the elegant home. She'd even begun making subtle suggestions about improvements to the house, framing them as ways to help me maintain the property value. The new sound system in the guest wing was her idea, installed at my expense but programmed to her musical preferences. The renovated bathroom adjacent to her room had been positioned as necessary, updating, though the marble fixtures she'd selected cost more than most people's annual salaries. Most manipulatively, Andrea had begun inserting herself into my business relationships and social circles. She'd started attending charity board meetings as my assistant, gradually taking on responsibilities that made her appear to be contributing to the foundation's work, while actually creating more administrative tasks for me. At social events, she'd position herself as my co-host, accepting compliments on our beautiful home and our successful events, while contributing nothing to the financial or organizational effort required. The dynamic between Gerald and Andrea had always been uncomfortably familiar, though I'd attributed their easy rapport to Andrea's frequent presence in our home over the years. Now I could see how they'd been bonding over their shared status as beneficiaries of my generosity, comparing notes on the most effective ways to manage my resources and maintain their access to luxury without accountability. Their conversations at family dinners often centered on shared complaints about how stressful money management must be for me, positioning themselves as sympathetic observers of my business responsibilities rather than the primary beneficiaries of my success. They'd exchange knowing looks when I took business calls during social events, as if my attention to the work that funded their lifestyle was an amusing quirk rather than a necessity. Gerald had even begun deferring to Andrea's opinions about household management, treating her as if she were a co-owner of the property rather than a temporary guest. When I'd questioned some of her more expensive suggestions for improvements, he'd supported her position, arguing that she had fresh eyes and could see opportunities for enhancement that I might miss because I was too close to the day-to-day details. The financial exploitation was substantial. I'd calculated that between Gerald's failed ventures and Andrea's ongoing support, I'd essentially redistributed over $2 million of my personal wealth to fund their lifestyles over the decades. But the psychological manipulation was even more damaging. They'd systematically trained me to view my own success as a family resource while treating my needs as secondary to their comfort and convenience. I'd become the invisible engine powering their social status, their leisure time, and their sense of security, while being gradually excluded from the benefits of the lifestyle I'd created. They lived in my house, spent my money, and enjoyed my hard-won social position while treating me like a benevolent but slightly tedious relative who existed primarily to facilitate their happiness. The affair I'd witnessed wasn't just a betrayal of my marriage or my trust in my sister. It was the logical conclusion of a decades-long pattern where Gerald and Andrea had learned to take everything I offered while giving me nothing in return except the privilege of continuing to serve their needs. But they'd made one crucial miscalculation. They'd assumed that my generosity came from weakness rather than strength, and that my willingness to support them meant I was incapable of withdrawing that support. They were about to discover how wrong they were. The ultimate irony of my situation became clear when I remembered the conversation that had taken place just 3 weeks before I discovered their affair, a conversation that now felt like the final insult in a lifetime of unappreciated generosity. It had been a Sunday evening in late November, the kind of crisp autumn night that made our estate look like something from a magazine spread. Andrea, Gerald and I were sitting in the library after dinner, the fire crackling in the marble fireplace while we sipped brandy from crystal snifters that had belonged to my grandmother. The scene was picture-perfect domesticity, the kind of moment that should have filled me with contentment about the family life I'd worked so hard to create and maintain. I'd been feeling particularly reflective that evening, partly because I'd just completed the most successful quarter in my business's history. 3 major property acquisitions had closed that month, including a commercial complex that would generate substantial rental income for years to come. At 72, I was still actively building wealth while most of my peers were focused on managing their retirement portfolios. The success felt significant, worth sharing with the 2 people who meant the most to me. "I've been thinking about our future," I'd said, setting down my brandy and looking at both of them with the kind of serious expression that usually preceded important family announcements. "About legacy and what happens to everything I've built when I'm gone." Gerald had looked up from his book with mild interest, while Andrea had given me her full attention, though I now realized her focus probably had less to do with family concern and more to do with financial curiosity about her potential inheritance. "I've been working with my estate attorney to restructure my will," I'd continued, feeling a warmth in my chest as I prepared to share what I thought would be wonderful news. "I want to make sure both of you are completely secure, that you'll never have to worry about money or lose this home that means so much to all of us." I'd pulled out a folder of documents I'd been carrying around for weeks, waiting for the right moment to present my gift. "Gerald, I'm setting up a trust that will provide you with a monthly income of $15,000 for the rest of your life, plus full ownership of the estate and all its furnishings. You'll never have to think about bills or maintenance, everything will be handled by the trust." Gerald had nodded approvingly, though with the kind of casual acceptance that suggested he'd always assumed such arrangements would be made for his benefit. "That's very thoughtful, Charlotte, very practical." "And Andrea," I'd turned to my sister with a smile that felt genuine and warm, "I'm establishing a separate trust for you with a lump sum of $800,000 plus a monthly stipend of $5,000 for life. You'll also have the right to live in the guest wing for as long as you want, with all expenses covered." The silence that followed wasn't the grateful surprise I'd expected. Instead, Andrea and Gerald had exchanged a look I couldn't quite interpret at the time, a look I now realized was panic mixed with calculation. "Charlotte, that's incredibly generous," Andrea had said slowly, her voice carrying an odd tone that I'd mistaken for overwhelming gratitude. "But have you really thought this through? I mean, trusts can be so complicated, and there might be tax implications that could affect the estate's value." Gerald had nodded in agreement, suddenly becoming animated in a way that seemed strange, given the magnitude of what I'd just offered. "Andrea raises a good point. And honestly, darling, at our age, maybe we should be thinking about simplifying rather than creating more complex financial arrangements." I'd felt confused by their response, wondering if I'd somehow misunderstood what they would want. "I thought you'd be relieved to know your futures were secure. Gerald, you've always said you hate dealing with financial planning, and Andrea, you've mentioned being worried about your retirement." "Oh, we appreciate the thought," Andrea had said quickly, "but maybe there are other ways to handle this. Less formal ways that wouldn't tie up so much money in legal structures." Gerald had leaned forward, adopting the persuasive tone he'd perfected during his failed sales career. "What if, instead of trusts, you simply added our names to your bank accounts and property deeds? That way, everything would transfer naturally without all the legal complexity and expense." The suggestion had struck me as odd, but I'd been so focused on their apparent discomfort with my generous offer that I'd missed the red flag entirely. "That would mean you'd have immediate access to everything, including the ability to make financial decisions about my assets while I'm still alive." "Exactly," Andrea had said with enthusiasm that now seemed grotesquely inappropriate. "It would be so much simpler. No lawyers, no trust administrators, no complicated paperwork, Just a straightforward transfer of ownership that acknowledges what we all know, that this is really a family estate, not just your personal property. I'd sat there in stunned silence, processing what they were actually suggesting. They wanted me to give them immediate control over my entire financial empire while I was still alive and capable of managing it myself. They were rejecting my generous gift of future security in favor of immediate ownership of everything I'd spent decades building. I don't think that's wise, I'd said carefully. Adding your names to active accounts would give you control over business decisions that require daily attention and expertise. The trust structure ensures you're provided for without creating complications for ongoing operations. Gerald's expression had shifted from persuasive to mildly irritated. Charlotte, you're overthinking this. We're family. Do you really think we'd make financial decisions that weren't in everyone's best interest? It's not about trust, I'd replied, though even as I said it, I was beginning to realize that perhaps it should have been. It's about practical management. My real estate portfolio requires active oversight, strategic planning, constant attention to market conditions. Which is exactly why you need help, Andrea had interrupted. You're 72 years old, Charlotte. Maybe it's time to let the younger generation take on some of these responsibilities. The younger generation, Andrea was 67 and had never successfully managed her own finances for more than 6 months at a time. Gerald was 73 and had a 4-decade track record of financial failure, yet they were positioning themselves as more capable managers of my assets than I was. I appreciate your concern, I'd said with growing firmness, but I'm perfectly capable of managing my own affairs. The trust structure stands. It's designed to provide for both of you generously while protecting the assets that generate that income. The conversation had ended awkwardly, with both Gerald and Andrea expressing lukewarm gratitude for my generous offer while making it clear they viewed my refusal to hand over immediate control as unnecessarily controlling and suspicious. Over the following weeks, they'd continued to bring up the topic in subtle ways. Gerald would mention how complicated trust structures were, and how much simpler direct ownership would be. Andrea would comment on how young and sharp she still felt, implying that she was perfectly capable of helping manage financial decisions. Now, standing in my kitchen 3 weeks later with the image of their naked bodies burned into my memory, I understood exactly why they'd been so eager to gain immediate access to my assets. They weren't planning to wait for my death to enjoy the fruits of my labor. They were planning to take control while conducting their affair under my own roof, using my own resources to fund whatever future they'd imagined together. My generous offer of lifetime security hadn't been rejected because it was inadequate. It had been rejected because it didn't give them the immediate control they needed to execute whatever plan they'd developed during their secret relationship. I'd offered them everything, and they'd demanded more. Now they were about to discover what nothing looked like. The final insult that shattered whatever remained of my willingness to tolerate their betrayal came exactly 1 week after I'd discovered them together. I'd spent those 7 days in a strange state of suspended animation, going through the motions of normal life while my mind processed the magnitude of what I'd witnessed. I hadn't confronted them yet, partly from shock, partly from a growing desire to understand the full scope of their deception before I acted. During that week, I'd watched them with new eyes, cataloging every casual intimacy, every shared glance, every moment of complicity that I'd previously missed or dismissed. They weren't even particularly careful about hiding their relationship once I knew what to look for. Gerald would touch Andrea's shoulder when passing her coffee. Andrea would laugh at Gerald's jokes with the kind of genuine delight she'd never shown for any of her actual husbands. They moved around each other in the kitchen, with the familiarity of people who'd been sharing more than just living space. But it was the planning conversation I overheard on that Tuesday morning that transformed my hurt and anger into something much more dangerous: cold, calculated fury. I'd been in my study, reviewing quarterly reports from my property managers, when I heard voices drifting from the breakfast nook. Gerald and Andrea were having coffee, speaking in the kind of intimate conspiratorial tones that couples use when discussing their private affairs. I wouldn't have paid attention except for one phrase that stopped me cold: when we sell the estate. I sat perfectly still, my financial reports forgotten, as their conversation continued. The realtor said properties like this are selling within weeks in the current market. Andrea was saying, her voice carrying an excitement I'd never heard when she discussed her own life prospects. 15 acres with the main house and outbuildings, fully renovated in this location. We're looking at probably 18 to 20 million, minimum. Gerald's response made my blood run cold. Even after taxes and fees, that leaves us with enough to buy something smaller but still elegant, maybe in Charleston or Savannah, and invest the rest for a very comfortable retirement. I've been thinking about a penthouse condo, Andrea added with the kind of dreamy enthusiasm most people reserve for discussing lottery winnings. Something modern and low maintenance. No more worrying about groundskeeping or household staff or all these rooms we don't really need. The foundation work will be trickier, Gerald said, and I could hear papers rustling as if they were reviewing documents. Charlotte's built such a complex web of business interests and charitable commitments. But once we have control of the estate and the primary accounts, we can start liquidating the commercial properties systematically. How long do you think the whole process will take? Andrea asked. 6 months to a year for the real estate sales, maybe another year to fully dissolve the business interests and consolidate everything into more manageable investments. The charity work will have to end, obviously. We can't maintain that level of financial commitment, and honestly, it's time Charlotte stopped giving away our inheritance to strangers. Our inheritance. They were discussing the systematic destruction of everything I'd built over 5 decades as if it were already theirs. As if my life's work was nothing more than an unnecessarily complicated obstacle to their retirement planning. What about Charlotte herself? Andrea asked, and for a moment I thought she might express some concern for my well-being in their future plans. Gerald's answer destroyed that hope entirely. The Sunset Manor facility in Charleston has excellent care programs for people with early dementia, very discreet, very comfortable. She'd probably be happier there anyway, with professional staff trained to handle her confusion about financial matters. The casual cruelty of it took my breath away. They weren't just planning to steal my assets, they were planning to have me declared incompetent and institutionalized to facilitate their theft. The woman who'd built a multi-million-dollar empire through 5 decades of shrewd business decisions would be labeled as suffering from dementia because she'd refused to hand over immediate control of her assets to 2 people whose combined financial acumen couldn't balance a checkbook. The timing will be important, Andrea continued, apparently having no qualms about discussing my involuntary commitment. We need to establish a pattern of concerning behavior, maybe some documentation of poor financial decisions or confusion about daily tasks. Dr. Hodge has been our family physician for years, Gerald replied. I'm sure he'd be sympathetic to our concerns about Charlotte's mental state, especially if we present it as wanting what's best for her care and safety. They had it all figured out. The medical professional who would declare me incompetent, the legal process for gaining control of my assets, the timeline for liquidating my business empire, the facility where they'd warehouse me while they spent my money, even the justification they'd use with friends and family, concerned relatives making difficult but necessary decisions for an aging woman who could no longer manage her own affairs. I sat in my study for a long time after their voices faded, staring at the quarterly reports that documented my continued financial success and sharp business judgment. These weren't the financial records of someone suffering from dementia. These were the results of a 72-year-old woman who was still operating at the peak of her professional capabilities, still making strategic decisions that increased wealth rather than depleting it. But none of that would matter if Gerald and Andrea succeeded in their plan. Once they gained legal control of my assets through a competency hearing, the truth about my mental state would become irrelevant. They'd have months or even years to liquidate everything before anyone could successfully challenge their authority. The betrayal was complete now. It wasn't just about an affair, or even about financial exploitation. They were planning to steal my identity, my autonomy, my freedom, and my life's work, then discard me in an institution while they enjoyed the fruits of my 5 decades of labor. As I sat there in the study where I'd made countless business decisions that had built our fortune, I realized that Gerald and Andrea had made one crucial error in their planning. They'd assumed that Charlotte Carlisle was a helpless old woman who could be manipulated, discarded, and forgotten. They were about to learn exactly how wrong they were. The morning after overhearing their devastating conversation, I did something I hadn't done in years. I called in sick to my charity board meeting and spent the day educating myself about elder abuse, financial exploitation, and the legal remedies available to protect someone in my position. What I discovered was both terrifying and empowering. My first call was to Patricia Gideon, the most ruthless family law attorney in the state, and a woman I'd known professionally for 15 years through various charity functions. Patricia specialized in high-net-worth divorces and elder abuse cases, with a reputation for protecting wealthy clients from predatory family members. If anyone could help me understand my options, it would be her. "Charlotte," Patricia said when her secretary put me through. "What a pleasant surprise. Though I have to say, people don't usually call me for pleasant reasons. I'm afraid this isn't pleasant either," I replied, settling into my study chair and closing the door. "I need to understand my legal position regarding some family members who may be planning to exploit my assets through competency proceedings." The silence on the other end told me that Patricia understood immediately how serious this was. "Can you be in my office this afternoon? And Charlotte, bring all your financial documents, everything." 3 hours later, I sat in Patricia's downtown office overlooking the harbor, watching her review bank statements, property deeds, business incorporation papers, and medical records I'd requested from Dr. Hodge that morning. Her expression grew more intense with each document. "Charlotte, your financial portfolio is extraordinary for someone of any age, but particularly impressive for a 72-year-old managing everything personally," she said, finally. "Your medical records show perfect cognitive function, no signs of dementia or mental decline. Your business decisions over the past year have been consistently profitable and strategically sound. But could they succeed in having me declared incompetent anyway?" I asked, voicing my deepest fear. Patricia leaned back in her leather chair, her expression grim. "With the right doctor and enough fabricated evidence of concerning behavior, it's possible. Competency hearings rely heavily on testimony from family members and medical professionals. If your husband and sister coordinate their stories and find a compliant physician, they could potentially convince a judge that you're no longer capable of managing your affairs." The confirmation of my worst fears should have been devastating, but instead it clarified my thinking in a way that felt almost liberating. What can I do to protect myself? "Several things, and we need to move quickly," Patricia said, pulling out a legal pad and beginning to write. "First, we establish a clear record of your continued competency through comprehensive medical and psychological evaluations with independent specialists. Second, we document any evidence of their planning or conspiracy. Third, we restructure your assets to make them harder to access even if they gain temporary legal control. Over the next 2 hours, Patricia outlined a comprehensive strategy that was more sophisticated than anything Gerald and Andrea could have imagined. We would create multiple layers of protection, irrevocable trusts that couldn't be dissolved even by a competency court, offshore accounts that required multiple trustees to access, and business structures that would continue operating independently of my personal legal status. The beauty of this approach, Patricia explained as she sketched out the legal framework, is that it's all perfectly legitimate estate planning that any wealthy person might undertake. But it will make it nearly impossible for them to liquidate your assets quickly, even if they temporarily gain control. But the most important revelation came when Patricia explained the concept of constructive fraud in elder abuse cases. If we can prove they were planning to exploit you financially while maintaining a relationship of trust, the husband and sister living in your home, benefiting from your support, then their affair becomes evidence of a conspiracy to defraud you of your assets. You mean the affair isn't just a personal betrayal, I said slowly, understanding dawning. It's evidence of criminal intent. Exactly. They've been living in your home, accepting your financial support, and planning your institutionalization while conducting an affair that would give them shared motivation to control your wealth. That's not just adultery, it's conspiracy to commit elder abuse and financial exploitation. The legal education continued with Patricia's security expert, a former FBI agent named William Seeley who specialized in protecting high-net-worth individuals from family predators. Within hours, my house was equipped with discrete recording devices in common areas, completely legal since it was my own property and I was protecting myself from potential criminals. The key, William explained as he showed me how to access the recordings remotely, is documenting their planning conversations and any attempts to manipulate your medical care or legal status. We need evidence of intent, not just opportunity. By evening, I had a complete understanding of my legal position and the tools to protect myself. More importantly, I understood something about myself that I'd forgotten during decades of accommodating other people's needs. I was formidable when I chose to be. The woman who'd built a business empire through 5 decades of strategic thinking and calculated risk-taking was still there, still sharp, still capable of outmaneuvering opponents who'd underestimated her capabilities. Gerald and Andrea had made the mistake of seeing only the generous wife and sister who'd supported them for years. They'd failed to recognize the steel-minded businesswoman who'd created the wealth they were so eager to steal. That night, as I reviewed the legal documents Patricia had prepared and listened to my first recorded conversation between my husband and sister, I felt something I hadn't experienced in years. The thrill of intellectual combat with worthy adversaries. Except Gerald and Andrea weren't worthy adversaries. They were amateurs playing a game against a professional. They'd spent weeks planning my downfall. I would spend the next few days ensuring their destruction was both swift and complete. The student had become the teacher and class was about to begin. The recording devices William had installed captured everything I needed within 72 hours. Gerald and Andrea had grown so comfortable in their conspiracy that they discussed their plans with the casual openness of people planning a vacation rather than the systematic destruction of another person's life. Their most damning conversation occurred on Thursday evening while I was supposedly attending a hospital board meeting, an event I'd actually skipped to monitor their activities from my car in the estate's wooded back 40. Through the sophisticated audio system William had installed, I listened in real time as they refined their timeline for my doctor. Hodge confirmed he'd be willing to evaluate Charlotte's mental state if we express formal concerns. Gerald was saying, his voice carrying the satisfaction of someone who believed his plan was proceeding perfectly. He mentioned that financial confusion and paranoia are common early signs of dementia in elderly women. Perfect, Andrea replied. And I've been documenting little incidents that could support that narrative. Yesterday, she asked me twice about the landscaping bills, and this morning she seemed confused about which day her charity meeting was scheduled. The lies were so casual, so effortlessly constructed, that I felt a chill of recognition. This wasn't their first conversation about fabricating evidence of my incompetence. They'd clearly been building their case for weeks, possibly months. What about the timing for the competency petition? Andrea continued. Patricia thinks early January would be ideal. Holiday stress often exacerbates mental decline in elderly patients, so any behavioral changes we document over Christmas and New Year's will seem particularly significant to a judge. My hands tightened on the steering wheel as I realized they'd deliberately chosen the holidays, a time when families traditionally come together, to execute the final phase of their plan to destroy me. They were going to use Christmas as the backdrop for my legal assassination. The beautiful thing, Gerald continued, is that once we have guardianship, all her previous financial decisions become irrelevant. We can argue that the complex business structures she's created are evidence of her declining judgment, and consolidate everything into more manageable investments. How long before we can access the principal assets? Andrea asked with the eager tone of someone discussing Christmas presents. 6 months, maybe less. The courts generally approve asset liquidation quickly when it's presented as simplifying an incompetent person's financial situation for their own protection. I'd heard enough. I drove home in the gathering darkness, my mind working with the cold precision that had made me successful in business for 5 decades. Gerald and Andrea had provided me with a complete roadmap of their intentions, a detailed timeline of their planned actions, and most importantly, evidence of criminal conspiracy that would ensure their plan backfired spectacularly. The next morning, I implemented the first phase of my response. At 9 a.m. sharp, I walked into Dr. Hodge's office for an unscheduled visit, carrying a folder that contained recordings of Gerald's conversation about enlisting the doctor's cooperation in fabricating a dementia diagnosis. Charlotte, Dr. Hodge said with surprise as his receptionist ushered me into his private office. Gerald mentioned you might be coming in for a cognitive evaluation, but I wasn't expecting you so soon. I'm here about that conversation, I said calmly, settling into the chair across from his desk and placing a small recording device between us. The one where my husband asked you to diagnose me with dementia based on fabricated evidence of mental decline. The color drained from Dr. Hodge's face as I played 30 seconds of Gerald's voice, discussing their plan to use the doctor's medical authority to support false competency proceedings. When the recording ended, the silence in the office was absolute. Charlotte, I had no idea, he began, but I held up my hand. Doctor, you have a choice. You can continue to participate in my husband's scheme to steal my assets through fraudulent medical diagnosis, in which case I'll be filing complaints with the state medical board and the district attorney's office this afternoon. Or you can document my actual mental state truthfully and professionally. Dr. Hodge spent the next 2 hours conducting the most thorough cognitive evaluation of his career, testing everything from basic mental function to complex problem-solving abilities. The results, which he documented meticulously, showed cognitive function in the superior range for someone half my age. By afternoon, I had official medical documentation that would make any future competency challenge not just unsuccessful, but potentially criminal for those who initiated it with fabricated evidence. My second stop was the office of Judge Thomas Seeley, a family court magistrate I'd known professionally for 20 years through my charity work. While I couldn't discuss my specific situation with him directly, I could make a generous donation to the court system's victim advocacy program, and mention in passing my concern about the growing problem of elder abuse in our community. It's particularly tragic, I told the judge over coffee, when family members exploit trust relationships to steal from elderly relatives. The psychological damage is often worse than the financial loss. Judge Seeley nodded gravely. We see those cases regularly. The good news is that courts are becoming much more sophisticated about identifying false competency petitions, especially when they're motivated by financial gain rather than genuine concern for the elderly person's welfare. The conversation continued for 20 minutes, during which I learned that competency petitions required substantial evidence, multiple medical opinions, and often triggered automatic investigations when significant assets were involved. More importantly, false petitions carried serious criminal penalties for the petitioners. By evening, I had medical documentation proving my competence, judicial awareness of potential elder abuse in my social circle, and a complete recording archive of Gerald and Andrea's conspiracy. But I wasn't finished. The third phase of my response began at dinner that night, when I announced to my unsuspecting husband and sister that I'd made a decision about my estate planning. "I've been thinking about our conversation last month," I said casually over the excellent salmon I'd prepared. "About simplifying my financial arrangements and making things easier for both of you." Gerald and Andrea exchanged quick glances, hope lighting their faces for the first time since I'd discovered their affair. "I've decided you were right," I continued with a smile that felt like ice forming on my lips. "It is time to simplify things. Starting tomorrow." They had no idea that their own words, recorded for posterity, were about to become the instruments of their complete destruction. The following morning arrived with the crisp clarity of a perfect December day, and I woke with the satisfaction of someone who'd spent the night planning the perfect chess match. Gerald and Andrea had no idea that their casual breakfast conversation would be their last as comfortable residents of my estate. I'd timed my revelation carefully. Friday morning meant they'd have the entire weekend to process what was about to happen, with no business offices open to seek immediate legal counsel. By the time they could consult attorneys on Monday, the initial shock would have settled into the kind of desperate panic that leads to poor decision-making. They were both in the breakfast nook when I joined them, Gerald reading his newspaper while Andrea scrolled through her phone, probably researching expensive vacation destinations she assumed she'd soon be able to afford. The domestic tranquility of the scene would have been touching if I hadn't known they were planning my imprisonment and financial destruction. "I have an announcement," I said, settling into my chair with the folder of documents I'd prepared. "About those simplifications we discussed." Gerald looked up with interest, while Andrea set down her phone, both of them wearing expressions of barely contained anticipation. "I've spent considerable time reviewing my financial situation and our family dynamics," I continued, opening the folder and spreading several documents across the table. "And I've concluded that you're absolutely right. Things have become far too complicated." "That's wonderful, Charlotte," Andrea said quickly. "We really think this will be better for everyone." "I'm sure you do," I replied with a smile that neither of them seemed to recognize as dangerous. "Which is why I've taken decisive action to simplify everything immediately." I placed the first document in front of Gerald, a formal eviction notice, prepared by Patricia Gideon's office, and completely legal under state landlord-tenant law. "Gerald, you have 30 days to vacate the premises. All of your personal belongings may be removed, but anything purchased with funds from my accounts remains as property of the estate." The newspaper slipped from Gerald's hands as he stared at the legal document. "Charlotte, what is this? What are you talking about?" "I'm talking about the conversation you had with Andrea on Tuesday evening," I said calmly, placing a small recording device on the table between us. "The one where you discussed having me declared incompetent, so you could liquidate my assets and commit me to Sunset Manor." The blood drained from Andrea's face as I pressed play, filling the breakfast nook with Gerald's voice discussing Dr. Hodge's willingness to fabricate a dementia diagnosis. When the recording ended, I placed a second eviction notice in front of Andrea. "Your 30-day notice as well. I've also canceled the credit cards I provided you, frozen the bank account where I deposited your monthly allowance, and terminated your access to the estate's vehicles." "Mom, this is insane," Andrea stammered, though her use of Mom instead of my name revealed how desperately she was trying to re-establish emotional connection. You can't just throw us out over a misunderstanding. A misunderstanding, I laughed, the sound sharp enough to make them both flinch. Let me play another recording for you. The one where you discussed selling my estate and buying a penthouse in Charleston with the proceeds. As their voices filled the air, describing in detail how they planned to liquidate my life's work, I watched their faces cycle through shock, fear, and finally calculation. They were already trying to figure out how to minimize the damage and salvage their position. Charlotte, please, Gerald said, when the second recording ended. You have to understand. We were just talking hypothetically. People discuss all sorts of scenarios that they never intend to pursue. Hypothetically, I repeated, savoring the word. Is that what you call conspiracy to commit elder abuse? Because that's how the district attorney's office will classify it when I file charges on Monday morning. The threat of criminal prosecution had the desired effect. Both Gerald and Andrea began speaking at once, their voices overlapping in a desperate chorus of justification and pleading. We never actually did anything. It was just conversation. You can't prove intent. We were worried about your health. I held up my hand, and the sudden silence that followed demonstrated exactly how completely the power dynamic had shifted in our relationship. Here are your options, I said with the calm authority I'd perfected during decades of business negotiations. Option 1. You accept the eviction notices, remove your belongings within 30 days, and disappear from my life permanently. In exchange, I won't pursue criminal charges for conspiracy to commit elder abuse. I placed another document on the table, a comprehensive restraining order that Patricia had prepared. Option 2. You contest the evictions or attempt to remain in contact with me after the 30-day period. In that case, I file all recordings with the district attorney, pursue criminal charges, and ensure that your names are permanently associated with elder abuse in every newspaper in the state. Gerald's face had taken on a grayish pallor that made him look far older than his 73 years. Charlotte, you can't be serious. Where would we go? What would we live on? I imagine you'll figure something out, I replied. Andrea managed to support herself between marriages. And Gerald, you're certainly welcome to pursue another of your entrepreneurial ventures. With your own money, of course. But we don't have any money, Andrea said, her voice rising to a pitch that suggested genuine panic. Everything we have, everything we've been living on came from you. Yes, I agreed pleasantly. That's rather the point, isn't it? You've spent decades living off my generosity while planning to steal everything I've built. Now you'll have the opportunity to discover what life looks like when you actually have to support yourselves. The negotiation continued for another hour, with Gerald and Andrea alternating between anger, pleading, and attempts at emotional manipulation. They offered to abandon their plans, to make amends, to seek counseling, anything except actually leaving the comfortable life I'd provided. But I'd learned something crucial about myself during this process. After 5 decades of putting their needs before my own dignity, I was finally ready to prioritize my own well-being over their comfort. The 30-day clock starts today, I said finally, gathering my documents and standing up from the table. I suggest you start packing. As I walked away from their desperate voices, I felt something I hadn't experienced in years, the profound satisfaction of being feared rather than taken for granted. The negotiation was over. Now came the even more satisfying part, watching them discover what powerlessness felt like. The 30 days that followed were a masterclass in how quickly people's true characters emerge when their comfortable illusions are stripped away. Gerald and Andrea's responses to losing their privileged positions revealed everything I needed to know about the people I'd been supporting for decades. Gerald's reaction was perhaps the most pathetic. After the initial shock wore off, he began what I can only describe as a campaign of weaponized nostalgia. He'd appear in doorways where I was working, holding photo albums from our early marriage or small mementos from family vacations, speaking in the wounded tone of someone who couldn't understand how 45 years of marriage could be discarded over a simple misunderstanding. "Look at this, Charlotte," he said one morning, finding me in my study and placing a faded photo on my desk. "Remember our anniversary trip to Paris in 1995? We were so happy then. We can have that again if you'll just give us a chance to work through this." The photograph showed us standing in front of the Eiffel Tower, my arm around his waist, both of us smiling at the camera with what looked like genuine affection. What Gerald didn't know was that I remembered that trip with perfect clarity, including how I'd paid for every expense while he'd complained about the exchange rate and insisted we stay at expensive hotels I couldn't really afford at the time. "I remember that trip very well," I replied without looking up from my financial reports. "I remember working 60-hour weeks for 3 months to save up for it. And I remember you spending the entire vacation talking about the restaurant you wanted to open in Paris after we got home." Gerald's face fell as he realized his carefully chosen memory had backfired. That was different. I was younger then, more ambitious. "People change, Charlotte. I've changed." "Yes, you have changed," I agreed, finally looking at him directly. "You've become more comfortable taking my money and more creative about justifying it. But the fundamental dynamic has remained exactly the same for 45 years. Andrea's approach was more sophisticated, but equally manipulative. She'd begun positioning herself as the victim of Gerald's influence, claiming she'd been swept up in his planning and had never truly intended to participate in defrauding me. "Charlotte, you have to understand," she said, during one of her many attempts to corner me for private conversations. "I was vulnerable after the divorce. Gerald was very persuasive, very convincing about how this would be better for everyone, including you. I see now how wrong that was." She'd even gone so far as to suggest that she could testify against Gerald in exchange for leniency, an offer that revealed both her desperation and her fundamental misunderstanding of the situation. She still thought this was about choosing between them rather than about my decision to choose myself for the first time in decades. "Andrea," I'd replied calmly, "I have recordings of you enthusiastically discussing the sale of my estate and my commitment to an institution. You weren't a victim of Gerald's influence, you were an eager participant in planning my destruction. But it was their joint attempt at intervention that truly demonstrated how little they understood about the irreversible nature of their situation." On day 22 of their eviction period, I came home from a charity board meeting to find them both waiting in the living room with William, Colleen, and Nikita, my 3 adult children, who'd driven down from Charlotte and Atlanta for what Gerald had apparently described as a family crisis. "Mom," William said as I walked into the room, his expression serious but concerned rather than accusatory. "Dad and Aunt Andrea have told us about some kind of misunderstanding involving the estate planning. We thought maybe we could all sit down and work through this together." I looked around the room at my children's faces, seeing genuine worry mixed with confusion. Gerald and Andrea had clearly presented themselves as the injured parties in a family dispute, probably emphasizing my sudden decision to evict them without explaining the recordings or their conspiracy. "What exactly did they tell you?" I asked, settling into my favorite chair and maintaining the calm demeanor that had served me well in countless business negotiations. Colleen leaned forward, her voice gentle in the way she'd perfected during her career as a social worker. "They said you'd become suspicious about their relationship and were making financial decisions based on jealousy rather than rational planning." The audacity was breathtaking. They'd managed to frame their affair and their conspiracy to steal my assets as my problem with jealousy, turning their criminal planning into evidence of my emotional instability. "I see," I said, pulling out my phone and accessing the recording app William Seeley had installed. "Before we continue this family meeting, I think you should hear what they actually plan to do." For the next 20 minutes, I played selected excerpts from Gerald and Andrea's recorded conversations. My children's expressions shifted from confusion to shock to disgust as they heard their father and aunt discussing my institutionalization, the liquidation of my assets, and their excitement about the lifestyle they'd enjoy after stealing my life's work. When the recordings ended, the silence in the room was profound. William was staring at his father with an expression I'd never seen before, complete contempt mixed with disappointment so deep it seemed to age him years in minutes. "Dad," Nikita said finally, her voice barely above a whisper, "how could you even think about doing something like this to Mom?" Gerald began stammering excuses about how the recordings were taken out of context, how they'd never actually intended to follow through, how this was all just hypothetical planning that had gotten out of hand. But my children weren't foolish. They'd heard the enthusiasm in his voice, the detailed planning, the casual cruelty with which he discussed my fate. "Mom," Colleen said, turning to me with tears in her eyes, "I'm so sorry, we had no idea." "I know you didn't," I replied gently. "And I hope you understand why I can't allow them to remain in my home or my life." The family intervention Gerald and Andrea had orchestrated to save their positions had instead provided me with witnesses to their crimes and allies in my decision to remove them permanently from my life. By the time my children left that evening, the new equilibrium was clear. Gerald and Andrea would be gone in 8 days, and my real family, the children who truly loved me rather than just my assets, would remain as strong as ever. The revolution was complete. The monarchy of Charlotte Carlisle had been restored. 6 months after Gerald and Andrea walked out of my estate for the final time, I barely recognized the woman I'd become, or perhaps I should say, I'd finally remembered the woman I'd always been before decades of enabling had buried her beneath layers of misplaced generosity. The immediate aftermath of their departure had been surprisingly peaceful. I'd expected to feel lonely in the large house, but instead I discovered the profound satisfaction of living in a space that belonged entirely to me. Every room reflected my taste, my priorities, my decision-making. There were no more compromise, with Gerald's preference for dark masculine furnishings, or Andrea's requests for expensive improvements that served her comfort rather than the house's character. The guest wing where I'd discovered their affair had been completely renovated and transformed into an art studio, something I'd always wanted but never had time for when I was busy managing everyone else's dreams. At 72, I was learning to paint with the same focused intensity I'd once applied to real estate negotiations. My instructor, a local artist named Professor Tobias Hodge, had commented that I approached art with unusual discipline for someone just beginning. "Most people are tentative about trying new things," he'd said during one of our sessions. "You attack the canvas like you're confident about claiming the space." He was right. Confidence had become my default setting in ways that still surprised me. When the president of the hospital board had suggested I might want to step back from some of my more demanding committee responsibilities given my age, I'd looked him directly in the eye and asked if he had specific concerns about my performance, or if he was simply making assumptions based on outdated stereotypes about elderly women. I remained on every committee I wanted to serve on. The financial restructuring Patricia had implemented had exceeded even my optimistic projections. The new trust arrangements not only protected my assets from any future exploitation attempts, but had also created tax advantages that increased my net worth by nearly $2 million. My business portfolio, freed from the constant drain of supporting Gerald's failed ventures and Andrea's lifestyle, was generating more income than I could spend even with my increased charitable giving and personal indulgences. Last month, I'd purchased a small vacation home in Savannah, not because I needed another property, but because I wanted one. The distinction felt revolutionary. For the first time in my adult life, My financial decisions were based purely on my own desires rather than someone else's needs or expectations. The divorce proceedings had been swift and decisive. Gerald's attorney had initially tried to claim spousal support and community property rights, apparently unaware that I had recordings of his conspiracy to steal my assets. When Patricia played 30 seconds of Gerald discussing my planned institutionalization, his lawyer had immediately shifted to negotiating the most minimal settlement possible to avoid criminal prosecution. Gerald received exactly what he'd brought to our marriage 45 years ago: nothing. He was currently living in a studio apartment in Charleston, working part-time at a bookstore to supplement his small Social Security payments. The man who'd spent decades living off my success was finally experiencing what it meant to support himself. Andrea had moved in with a friend in Atlanta, where she was attempting to rebuild her life at 67 with no assets, no job history, and no husband to fund her lifestyle. I'd heard through mutual acquaintances that she was working as a receptionist at a dental office, probably the first honest job she'd held in decades. I felt no satisfaction in their struggles, but I felt no guilt either. They'd made their choices, planned their betrayal, and now they were living with the consequences of underestimating the woman whose generosity they'd exploited. My children had rallied around me with support that felt genuine rather than obligatory. William had started bringing his own children for weekend visits, and my grandchildren were getting to know the real Charlotte Carlisle, rather than the accommodating figure who'd always deferred to their grandfather's preferences. Colleen had taken to calling me weekly just to chat, and Nikita had asked my advice about her own investment decisions, treating me as the business expert I'd always been rather than just the family caretaker. The most profound change was internal. At 72, I discovered what it felt like to live without constantly calculating the cost of other people's happiness or monitoring my words to avoid upsetting someone whose comfort I was funding. I made decisions quickly and confidently because I only had to consider my own interests and values. This morning I'd received a text message from a number I didn't recognize. "Charlotte, this is Andrea. I've been thinking about you and hoping we could talk. I'd like to apologize and maybe find a way to repair our relationship." I'd stared at the message for a long moment, then deleted it without responding. The woman who might have been moved by such an appeal, the woman who'd spent decades prioritizing family harmony over personal dignity, no longer existed. I was Charlotte Carlisle, 72 years old, successful businesswoman, generous philanthropist, loving mother and grandmother, and for the first time in my adult life, nobody's victim. I'd learned the difference between love and exploitation, between generosity and enabling, between family loyalty and self-destruction. And I'd learned that sometimes the kindest thing you can do for people who've been taking advantage of you is to stop providing them with opportunities to do so. Gerald and Andrea might eventually learn to build lives based on their own efforts rather than someone else's resources. Whether they did or not was no longer my responsibility. I was 72 years old, and my life was finally my own. The revolution was complete, and Queen Charlotte reigned supreme.
Up next, you've got 2 more standout stories right on your screen. If this one hit the mark, you won't want to pass these up. Just click and check them out. And don't forget to subscribe and turn on the notification bell so you don't miss any upload from us.